Shabbat Shalom. A few years ago, children's author Richard Michelson was awarded the Sidney Taylor Gold Medal from the Association of Jewish Libraries for his book, As Good as Anybody. The book tells the story and highlights the similarities and connections between two of the 20th century's greatest thinkers, poets, and prophets. And I came across the book a few years ago, and now every summer at Freedom School, I like to read this book. It begins by telling the story of a young boy named Martin. He was born a long time ago, January 15th, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. He was friendly and kind, but some of the other kids around him weren't so nice. And some of the kids, the book tells us, they told Martin that they couldn't be friends with him because his skin was so dark. And he noticed in his town of Atlanta that there were all sorts of places that he wasn't welcome, places that he couldn't go because of the color of his skin. You can't swim in this pool, they would tell him, whites only. You can't eat at this restaurant, they'd tell him, whites only. You can't sit at the front of the bus, he was told, whites only. And sometimes this made Martin so mad and so sad that he'd come home and he'd cry. And his father would sit with him and say, "Don't you worry, son. No matter what they say, you remember this. You're as good as anybody." And because of these experiences, Martin made a promise to himself. He said, "When I grow up, I'm going to do something about discrimination and hatred and racism. I'm going to do something to change the world." And then the story goes on to tell us about another little boy who was born a few years before Martin. And he grew up across the ocean in a town called Warsaw, in a country called Poland. But he had a similar set of experiences as Martin, even though he grew up so far away. Like Martin, young Abraham was friendly and kind, but many of the people around him weren't so nice. And some people told him that they couldn't be friends with him, not because of the color of his skin, but because of his religion, because he was a Jew. "We can't play with you. You're Jewish," they'd say. And he noticed in his town there were certain places that he wasn't welcome. "You can't swim at this pool. No Jews allowed," they'd tell him. "You can't eat at this restaurant. No Jews allowed," they'd tell him. "You can't work here. You can't study here. No Jews allowed." This made him so upset, so sad that he'd come home sometimes and cry. And his Abba sat down with him one night and he said, "Don't you worry, Abraham. No matter what they say, I want you to remember this. You're just as good as anybody." And because of these experiences, Abraham made a promise to himself. He said, "When I grow up, I'm going to do something about discrimination and hatred and anti-Semitism. I'm going to do my part to change the world." And here's what's amazing, but in some ways not so surprising at all. Many years later, Martin and Abraham became best of friends. They marched together for freedom and for justice. They changed the world, and they taught everyone that each of us is as good as anybody. It's fun to tell that story at Freedom School. I like looking around the room and seeing these young people, many of them Latino, African American, and watching their eyes as they make these connections between Martin and Abraham, between these communities. And you know, every Shabbat, every day really, is a good time to remember that each one of God's creatures is as good as anybody. That every person is created, as our Torah teaches, B'Tselem Elohim. Each and every one of us is created in God's own image, and the Torah makes no distinctions based on the color of one's skin, or where one grew up, or one's gender, or one's ethnicity or religion for that matter. But though any time is a good time to remember that lesson, in fact, every moment is an important moment to remember that lesson, this Shabbat is particularly appropriate for remembering this. And the reason is because Wednesday of this week, the week that is just passing, would have been the 110th birthday of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And on January 15th, in just 2 days, we celebrate what would have been Dr. Martin Luther King's 88th birthday. In my mind, I always think of Dr. King as someone who would have been much older than that, but he would only have been 88. King and Heschel will always be remembered together, especially by our Jewish community. When I think of Dr. King, in my mind's eye, I also see Heschel. I see that iconic photo that I'm sure you've seen of Heschel and King marching arm in arm in 1965 in Selma, and in other marches as well, but that's probably the best known photo. And I think about Heschel's incredible comment about that historic march from Selma to Montgomery for voters' rights. And it really sums up what many liberal Jews over many generations felt about the civil rights movement and about how the struggle for civil rights and for racial equality and for social justice more broadly connects to authentic spirituality and connects deeply to our Jewish tradition. And this is what Rabbi Heschel said. He said, "When I was marching with Dr. King, I felt as though my legs were praying." For Heschel, marching from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights was literally an act of prayer. It was an expression of a deeply held value. And for Heschel, prayer wasn't about making wishes. For Heschel, prayer was about making something happen. Their work together was prayer, and it was also, in a very deep way, Torah. Because the essence of Torah, if you distill it down to its very essence, Torah tells the story of a people going from slavery to freedom for a purpose. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and God freed us for a reason, for a purpose. And our purpose, ultimately, is to bring freedom, liberation, and redemption to the world. Not just for ourselves, but of course for ourselves as well, but for all humanity. And it's why we're reminded again and again in our tradition that because we were strangers in the land of Egypt, we know in a deep way the heart of the stranger. We're commanded to love the stranger as ourselves because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. We're commanded to worry about the needs of the other, not just our own community, but the needs of the other, because we know what it feels like and we know what it is like to be the other. When King and Heschel marched together, they were praying and they were teaching Torah as well. And they modeled love and respect, their relationship. They showed us that no matter what your religion is, no matter where you're born, no matter the color of your skin, we are all of us brothers and sisters, and we can and should work together to make the world a better place. It'd be wonderful if I could say here in 2017, we got that covered. We all see each other as brothers and sisters. We've never been more united. We've never been more prepared to march arm in arm towards goodness for all Americans and for all humanity. But we know that sadly, we're very, very far from that vision. Here's something that I found today that Dr. King had said. It was published in a magazine called The Southern Israelite, which later was renamed, as beautiful as that is, The Southern Israelite. It's now the Atlanta Jewish Journal or something like that. But it was the Jewish paper of Atlanta, and he said this in, I think, 1964. He said, and this was after a group of rabbis had come, many of them graduates of the Hebrew Union College and members of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. They had come down to march with Dr. King in St. Augustine, Florida. And he was deeply grateful that they had made this journey. And he said, "Can we ever express our appreciation to the rabbis who chose to give moral witness with us in St. Augustine during our recent protest against segregation in that unhappy city? And who will ever forget the sacrifice of two Jewish lives, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, in Mississippi this past June? It would be impossible to record the contribution that the Jewish people have made toward the Negro struggle for freedom. It has been so great," said Dr. King. And then he continued, "I solemnly pledge to do my utmost to uphold the fair name of the Jews, not only because we need their friendship, and surely we do, but mainly because bigotry in any form is an affront to us all." A few years later, Rabbi Heschel, in his book, The Insecurity of Freedom, wrote, 100 years ago, the emancipation was proclaimed. It is time for the white man to strive for self-emancipation, to set himself free of bigotry, to stop being a slave to wholesale contempt, a passive recipient of slander. The new year, the secular new year we just celebrated, and I like to think of Martin Luther King Jr. Day and the weekend and the Shabbat leading up to it as, just like on the Jewish New Year, an opportunity for Cheshbon HaNefesh, to look inside of ourselves and to think about who we are, and in particular as Americans, to think about who we are and the person that we've been in this year that has passed, in relationship to the struggle that Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King toiled so vigorously towards. As individuals and as a community, we should be asking ourselves, what have we done for the oppressed lately? It's nice to think back to the 1960s and the ways that the Jewish community played a meaningful role in the civil rights movement. But what have we done lately? We should be proud of the role that we've played, and we should commit ourselves ever more vigorously towards making the future that we dreamed of then. We're called by our tradition to pursue justice each and every day, and so we must continually measure ourselves against the high standards that our tradition demands. And we know, in some ways, we are more polarized today than ever before. The stain of slavery and Jim Crow is still not so distant, but the state of race in America today is complicated and challenging, and it feels sometimes like we've taken a step back. Questions about implicit and institutionalized racism in America persist. And this morning, right smack dab in between Heschel's birthday and King's birthday, the Justice Department released their findings of a 13-month investigation into the city of Chicago's police department. And the Justice Department concluded that the Chicago police have systematically violated the civil rights of residents by routinely using excessive force, a practice that particularly, the Justice Department notes, affects African Americans and Latinos. That's from today's paper. There's still much work to be done. And our tradition teaches, Vim lo achshav v'matai. Now is the time to get busy with that work. So I want to invite you, if you haven't already supported our freedom schools, you can go online and learn about ways that you can support those schools financially, and you can learn about ways that you can volunteer in our freedom schools over the summer, and there are opportunities even throughout the year. Rabbi Stern, in his message to us in the Wise Weekly, you can see it here and you can see it online, reminds us of ways that we can participate in big Sunday events that are happening this weekend, some of which are connected to Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And if you go and read his message online, there's a click-through so you can get right to that site. You're going to be learning from Cantor Lamb about ways that we can continue to build our partnership with Faithful Central Bible Church. We celebrated with them last year. They're coming again in February. And then we're going to be visiting the church. We have a date that we'll get out to you soon so that you can join us when we go there. There are 1,000 ways beyond that to make a difference. Those are just a few things that are happening right now. There's 1,000 ways, 1,000,000 ways, to reach out to our brothers and our sisters, arm in arm, praying and teaching Torah with our feet. This Shabbat, this weekend especially, let's recommit ourselves. Let's rededicate ourselves to the task that Martin and Abraham set out on those many years ago. Shabbat shalom.